Everybody in Bryer County knew Eve Calder had inherited the worst ranch in the basin. 63 acres of wind-cut Wyoming pasture, a leaning red barn, a gravel road that disappeared under snow every December, and behind a sagging fence, the ugliest herd in 3 counties. The Calder slatebacks were not the kind of cattle buyers liked to brag about. They were narrow through the hip, sharp-eyed, slate-gray along the spine, with old curved horns and a habit of looking at strangers like they had already made up their minds. At the sale barn, men laughed at them. At the feed store, they called them relics. At the bank, they called them a liability. Then a sickness moved through the valley so fast that ranchers started burying animals before the ground had thawed, and Eve Calder's herd did not lose a single cow. The strangest part was not what happened that winter. The strangest part was what Eve found in her grandfather's books the night after his funeral. 29 years of ledgers, hay, fence wire, diesel, tax, and 1 column, printed in careful black ink, left empty every single year. Veterinary invoices, not low, not occasional, empty. Eve sat at the old kitchen table until after midnight, turning page after page, while the wind scraped ice against the window glass. Her grandfather, Amos Calder, had written down every penny that ever crossed that ranch. He had saved receipts for baling twine, gasket sealant, salt blocks, and coffee for hired hands who had died before Eve was born. But there was no vet bill. Not in the last 5 years. Not in the last 10. Not when Eve had been a child and remembered calves running through spring mud with their tails high. The column stayed blank. The next morning, she stood beside the pasture gate with Amos's wool coat buttoned to her chin and watched the slateback's nose through frozen grass like the weather was only an inconvenience. That was when Leland Marr pulled up in a polished black truck. Marr owned Crown Basin beef, 18,000 acres of feedlot, breeding barns, metal chutes, corporate loans, and enough hired men to make himself feel like the valley was his. His cattle were huge, glossy, fast-growing animals that looked like they had been designed on a spreadsheet. He stepped out with a folded offer in his hand and a funeral smile on his face. Your grandfather kept sentiment alive longer than most men keep a tractor running, Marr said. But sentiment won't pay inheritance tax. Eve did not reach for the paper. Marr looked past her to the gray cattle scattered across the ridge. I'll lease the land this season, he continued. Then I'll buy when the bank gets tired of waiting. Those antiques can go to auction. You might get enough to cover hauling. The ranch is not for sale, Eve said. His smile thinned. You worked payroll in Cheyenne, didn't you? Then you understand numbers. My calves gain fast. Yours wander around chewing sagebrush and pretending it's a business. Eve looked at the folded offer. Then she looked at the empty vet column in her mind. I understand numbers better than you think. Mar leaned closer. By spring, you'll understand hunger. He drove off, spraying gravel against the ditch. For 6 weeks, the valley watched Eve like a slow accident. At the feed store, men lowered their voices when she walked in, but not enough. Old breed, bad pasture, no vaccinations, no cash. Dr. Russell Keene, the most expensive livestock veterinarian in the county, cornered her near the mineral tubs with the polished patience of a man used to being obeyed. Miss Calder, your grandfather's habits were dangerous, he said. Those animals of yours have never been on a modern herd health program. They've also never needed one, Eve said. Keene's mouth tightened. That is not medicine. That is luck with a long shadow. Eve held his gaze. 29 years is a strange kind of luck. His voice dropped. If those cattle carry something into the commercial herds, the state can shut you down in a day. I would hate to see Amos's name attached to a biosecurity failure. It was not advice. It was a warning wearing a white coat. By January, the warning had found its excuse. A blue norther rolled down from the high country and locked Briar County in ice. Truss froze solid before noon. Diesel gelled in tanks. Fence posts split open with sounds like rifle shots. Snow stacked against the barn doors and buried the lower road until the mail stopped coming. Eve worked from dark to dark. She carried feed by sled when the tractor refused to start. She broke ice with a splitting maul. She wrapped her hands until she could barely close them. The slate-backs did what they had always done. They pawed through crusted snow and found brown grass underneath. They bedded on the high shoulder of the hill, not in the mud. Their thick hides lifted in the wind like felted armor. Calves tucked behind their mothers and rose with steam coming off their backs. Across the fence, Crown Basin beef looked like a war zone. Mar's big animals crowded the windbreaks, coughing into each other's faces, too heavy and too soft for the cold they were standing in. Dr. Keene's clinic truck went in and out at all hours. Men hauled tarps. A disposal trailer appeared behind the breeding barn and never seemed to leave. One afternoon, Eve was repairing a cracked brace post when Mar marched through the snow to the boundary fence. His cheeks were gray. His expensive coat was stained with iodine. "Move your cattle back," he snapped. "They're on my side. They're infecting mine." Eve tightened the wire with slow, deliberate turns. "My cattle are not coughing. That's what carriers do." Mar jabbed a gloved finger toward the ridge. "Keene says your old scrub herd is probably carrying a resistant strain. I lost 38 head this week." 38. "My breeding program is bleeding out while your museum pieces stand there watching." Eve felt heat rise in her chest, but kept her voice flat. "Maybe your cattle were built for weight slips, not weather. Mar's face went hard. The state inspector will decide that. Keene is filing an emergency complaint. Once they see your records, they'll quarantine this place. If you can't pay for full testing, they can seize the herd. He lowered his voice. And they will. That night, Eve called an agricultural attorney in Casper. The attorney did not soften the answer. A licensed veterinarian could trigger an emergency review. Testing could cost more than Eve had in the bank. If the state believed her herd threatened the regional beef industry, the animals could be destroyed before she ever got a court date. After she hung up, Eve sat in the kitchen with Amos's ledgers spread around her, like a paper barricade. The blank vet column had looked like a miracle the first time she saw it. Now it looked like a target. For the next 9 nights, she slept in jeans and boots, with Amos's shotgun behind the pantry door. She walked the fences with a flashlight. She checked nostrils, eyes, breathing, manure, feed intake. She found nothing wrong. Not one wheeze, not one drooping calf, not one cow standing dull in the wind. Just the slate-backs, alive and insultingly calm. On the 10th night, the old ranch dog started barking at something east of the barn. Not a warning bark, a frantic, throat-tearing alarm. Eve was out of bed before she knew she had moved. She grabbed the shotgun, jammed her feet into frozen boots, and ran into the dark. The moon was thin. The snow was bright enough to show tracks. At the lower water tank, a man in a hooded canvas coat was climbing through the wire, with a metal can in one hand. Eve raised the gun. "Drop it." The man froze. The can hit the snow with a dull clang, and pale liquid splashed across the crust. Eve worked the shotgun once. The sound cracked across the pasture. "Hands where I can see them." The man turned. It was Nolan Price, one of Dr. Keene's clinic assistants. He was barely 30, with a face that had gone white enough to match the snow. "Please," he said, "I didn't want to." Eve kept the barrel steady. "What were you putting in my water tank?" Nolan looked at the spilled liquid, then at the cattle watching from the ridge. His voice broke. "Keene gave it to me. He said it would only make them test positive. He said Mar needed the quarantine fast, before the bank started asking questions." Eve took one careful step forward. "What is it?" "A respiratory culture from the clinic." Nolan swallowed hard. "Something from Crown Basin's sick pens. Keene said if your herd showed contamination, the state would order a cull, and Mar would buy the land for nothing." For a moment, the cold seemed to vanish. Eve felt only the clean, furious clarity of what she had almost lost. Her grandfather's herd, his life's work, a bloodline that had survived bad winters, thin grass, market men, and now this. "Take out your wallet," she said. Nolan obeyed with shaking hands. She took his clinic badge, his driver's license, and the key card clipped to his belt. Then she used a feed scoop to collect the stained snow and sealed it inside 2 freezer bags from the tack room. Nolan started crying. "They'll fire me," he said. Eve looked at him over the shotgun. "You should be worried about prison." She locked him in the equipment shed until dawn. Then she made one phone call, not to the sheriff, not to the county office. She called Dr. Mira Santos at the State University's Livestock Disease Lab. Amos had once spoken of her as the only scientist he trusted because she believed field survival counted as data. Eve told her everything. The ledgers, the winter, the complaint, the assistant in the shed, the contaminated snow. Dr. Santos did not interrupt once. When Eve finished, the line went silent for half a breath. Then Santos said, "Do not let anyone test those cattle until I arrive. Preserve the sample. Keep the assistant there. I am bringing state police and an independent chain of custody kit." 2 hours after sunrise, engines came up the road. But the first truck was not from the university. It was Leland Mars. Behind him came Dr. Keene's mobile clinic, 2 white agriculture department SUVs, and a deputy Eve recognized from every county fundraiser Marr had ever financed. Marr stepped out like a man arriving to collect property. Keene adjusted his gloves and would not look directly at the lower pasture. A state official named Harriet Vale walked to the porch with a sealed order in her hand. "Miss Calder," Vale said, "we have an emergency affidavit from Dr. Keene alleging active disease risk on this property. We are authorized to quarantine, draw samples, and begin removal protocols if necessary." Eve stood on the porch with the shotgun unloaded, but visible beside the door. "That affidavit was written before anyone examined my herd." Keene gave a cold little smile. "Disease control often requires speed. So does fraud," Eve said. Marr barked a laugh. "Listen to her. She's desperate." "No," Eve said. "Desperate men send employees across fences at night." Keene's smile disappeared. At the bottom of the road, another set of vehicles appeared. 2 state police cruisers, a university lab van, and in front of them, Dr. Mira Santos, a compact woman in a navy parka carrying a silver field case like it weighed nothing. Nolan Price sat in the rear cruiser with his head bowed. For the first time since Amos's funeral, Eve saw Leland Marr stop acting. Dr. Santos walked straight past him and handed Harriet Vale a preliminary statement. "This property is now part of an active tampering investigation," Santos said. "Mr. Price has provided a recorded confession that Dr. Keene supplied a contaminated livestock sample and ordered him to introduce it into the Calder herd's water supply." Keene stepped backward. A trooper moved with him. "That is absurd," Keene snapped. "He is a disgruntled employee." Santos opened her case on the hood of Marr's polished truck. "Then you will be relieved that we preserved the chain of custody." She ran the field test in silence. Wind moved through the yard. Cattle shifted on the ridge. Somewhere in the feedlot across the valley, a sick animal coughed. When the machine printed, Santos read once, then handed the strip to Vale. The sample contains concentrated respiratory pathogens, consistent with material taken from an infected commercial facility, she said. Not from an open pasture. Not from a healthy herd. From a managed outbreak. Vale's face changed. She turned to Keene. Doctor, did you submit an emergency affidavit against a herd you were attempting to contaminate? Keene said nothing. Marr exploded. This is Calder theater. She planted it. She knows she's finished. Eve looked at him then. Really looked the powerful man. The modern man. The man who thought every living thing in the valley could be bought, leased, drugged, pushed, or buried. And behind him, his entire operation was collapsing under the weight of animals bred to win a scale and lose a winter. Dr. Santos closed the field case. Miss Calder's herd will not be touched today. Crown Basin beef, however, is now under emergency quarantine, pending a full investigation into disease handling, false reporting, and attempted agricultural sabotage. The handcuffs went on Keene first. He did not fight. Men like him rarely fought when the law finally looked them in the eye. Marr tried to call his attorney, his lender, then someone higher than both. No one answered fast enough. Over the next 4 months, the valley learned what the clean trucks and new buildings had been hiding. Crown Basin had inflated herd values, buried losses, overused restricted drugs, pressured small neighbors into bad leases. Keene had signed whatever papers kept Marr's money moving and his own clinic full. The disease had not started at Eve's fence. It had started in crowded pens where profit had been stacked tighter than the animals. When prosecutors offered Keene a deal, he gave them Marr. When lenders saw the records, they walked. When buyers heard the quarantine history, they vanished. Crown Basin beef did not fall in a dramatic explosion. It failed the way rotten timber fails, one quiet crack at a time. By late spring, grass came up bright on the Calder hills. The slate-backs calved without help in the sheltered draw below the cottonwoods. Small gray calves wobbled up, shook the wet from their ears, and found milk before Eve could cross the field. No heat lamps, no intervention, no emergency call. Dr. Santos returned with a university team, not with suspicion, but with contracts. The researchers had tested the Calder herd for weeks. They found unusual, inherited resistance markers, hardiness traits, and immune patterns that commercial breeders had been trying to buy back after breeding them out for speed and size. Amos Calder had not been behind the industry. He had been guarding something the industry forgot it needed. The university offered Eve a multi-year conservation partnership, enough to repair the barn, clear the tax debt, and fence the upper lease. They did not pay her to modernize the slate-backs. They paid her not to ruin them. On the first warm morning of June, Eve carried Amos's old ledger onto the porch. The new account pages were clean. The grant deposit sat in the bank. The neighboring parcels from Crown Basin's auction were no longer out of reach. She opened to the ranch expense sheet. Hay was higher. Fence wire was higher. Taxes were cruel as ever. But the veterinary invoice column waited at the far right side of the page. White and empty. Eve uncapped her pen. For a long moment, she considered writing the number everyone had laughed at. Then she smiled and closed the book. Some proof is louder when it stays blank.